All right, so here we are. World War II is over, and we're entering the what next phase. So, we talked a little bit last time about the Yalta Conference, and that's what I want to go over a little bit today, just quickly explain kind of the consequences of the Yalta Conference. So, I'm going to look at some maps. We're going to come back to this slide in a second, but I want to talk about the partitioning and dividing of Germany because that's going to be a big part of the Cold War um, tension that will exist between the United States and Western Europe and the Soviets. All right, so Germany at Yalta gets divided into four sections. And eventually, this will kind of collapse into two sections, what will be known as West Germany and East Germany. The city of Berlin will be divided into four sections, eventually two sections, East Berlin and West Berlin. So let's talk a little bit more about that, looking at these maps. So first of all, what we have here is um, we have Germany. So this is Germany. This whole area here is Germany. And you notice it's been divided into four sections. So the Soviet Union had their sector. This was Soviet Germany. Here was Great British Germany. And here was French Germany. And here was the American sector. So these quadrants were divided into four. These were, of course, the big four allies during World War II. And notice right here, deep in the heart of Eastern Germany, or the Soviet sector, is the capital city of Berlin. Right? And this is land that was returned to Poland. Okay, so now let's take a closer look. This is Berlin. So now all this black area would represent the rest of the or at least part of the Soviet sector. So you can see the city of Berlin itself was divided into partitions into four sections. Okay, that's going to be important when we get to the 1960s and we see the creation of the Berlin Wall, which will divide Western. So we're going to see a wall go up around the edges of Western Berlin to keep people from escaping Eastern Germany into Western Berlin and being protected by the French, the British, or the Americans. All right. So let's go back a few slides. So the Soviet Union is really interested in setting up what we would call buffer zones in Eastern Europe that's maintaining control and having influence over countries like Poland, having influence obviously in Eastern Germany. And so they want to get Western influence out. They obviously were no longer allied together against the Nazi regime that posed a threat to everybody. So the relationship is faltering. So one of the first signs that there's going to be big trouble happens pretty early on with the Berlin airlift. So the partitioning of Berlin, remember, meant that Western Berlin was deep in the heart of Eastern Germany here. Right? So the Russians, the Soviets, cut off access to Western Berlin from the Allies in the hopes of getting that Western influence out of East Germany, right, to create a buffer zone. So you couldn't get trains in, you couldn't get transports in. They shut down all the roads. They cut off Berlin from the west, effectively, and they were hoping that this would lead to the Americans, the French, and the British withdrawing from Berlin, and then East Germany could be closed to Western influence. But the Americans and the British and the French resolved to do whatever it took to maintain control of Western Berlin, and this is what became known as the Berlin Airlift. So for a year, all supplies. So think about this. Here we have unique perspective, right in the middle of this COVID quarantine. You don't go out very often. There's not a lot of supplies. It's tough to get stuff. So that's what they're trying to do: starve out Western Berlin, and the Western powers airlift supplies into West Berlin. So they're dropping supplies every day, airplanes flying around the clock, dropping supplies since they can't get in by train or by road. All right. So this is kind of an indicator of how this Cold War conflict is going to go. Neither side wants to start up with World War III. It's going to be massively devastating. We don't want a violent conflict. So it's going to be this kind of cat and mouse game. Okay, so the United States is going to airlift supplies for a year, and finally Stalin say, forget it. You can bring your trains in, you can bring your trucks in, but he's not going to let people from East Berlin or the rest of Eastern Germany into Western Germany because once they get into West Berlin, because once you get into West Berlin, you are now in U.S., British, or French territory, and you can escape Soviet-controlled East Germany. Right, so we'll see that will begin to happen. Okay, so here's that buffer zone. So the Soviet Union had advanced during World War II and had not retreated. And so this is a big division. We're going to see Soviet states, these satellite states like Poland, you see there Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, the People's Republic of Romania. All of those are going to be Soviet states. And then Yugoslavia and Albania are going to be under the influence and pressure of the East, and you can see the Soviet Union there in the darker red. So this is that kind of buffer zone. Those satellites are technically independent countries, but heavily influenced by the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Okay, so what is the Cold War? Well, it's a diplomatic fight. So the tensions between the United States and the USSR are going to escalate rapidly after the end of World War II. Really, you could see the beginnings of this war, this Cold War, after the Bolshevik Revolution. So we saw a Red Scare in the 1920s. We could see that there were tensions between the American way of life and the Soviet way of life. And the Soviet way of life, like the American way of life, thought that its view ought to spread. And so the Americans feared that communism was spreading. The Soviets feared that democracy was spreading. And so there's this tension, and the goal is to of the Cold War is going to be to stop that spread. So a quarantine analogy is useful here. The United States begins to worry that if the nations near to the Soviet Union fall to communism, that one by one, they're going to topple. And this is the beginnings of what we call domino theory. And this is going to be one of the reasons we get involved in conflicts in Korea and why we get involved in the conflict in Vietnam. Is this fear that if one country falls, then the next will fall, then the next will fall. Okay, so the question is, well, what do we do? So George Kennan is going to propose a containment theory, and containment theory is a quarantine theory. He says, look, we don't want World War III. We can't handle World War III. The Soviets can't handle World War III, so they don't want to start World War III. We shouldn't go to war. We won't go to war. So let's contain or block the Soviets and stop communism from spreading. It's a flawed system, and it's either going to mellow out or eventually break up. We just need to stop it from growing. So that is containment theory. That's the initial response, and it's going to drive most of the Cold War thinking from subsequent presidents and advisors. So, what are some examples of that? One is the Marshall Plan. So, the United States is going to give massive amounts of money to Western European nations who are trying to rebuild democracies, right? And so, if you are on our side, if you ally with us, we will help you to rebuild your country. So, we're using our economic might, we're using our resources, and we're providing aid to Western European countries to fight against communism. We are going to use the CIA, so covert operations. It's where you start to get a lot of that cloak and dagger spy type of stuff happening. So we're going to finance groups in different countries to fight the communist influence in their country. President Truman is going to initiate a policy that becomes known as Truman Doctrine. This happens when he gives aid to Greece and Turkey in the form of missiles, weapons, and military and financial support in their efforts to fight communism, right? Again, suggesting that if you're going to stand up to the communists, the United States is behind you. We will provide you with the resources to do it. We're going to see the formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an actual military alliance formed against the Soviets, started by John Foster Dulles. So you should be reading about this in the book. These are some of the main examples of containment. SEATO and CENTO are the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization and the Central Treaty Organization that are covering obviously different regions of the world. Soviet response is the Warsaw Pact. So these are the countries that are still heavily under Soviet influence after World War II that are going to try to counterbalance NATO, right? The idea of NATO is that, you know, an independent country like Belgium in Europe is not going to be able to stand up to Soviet pressure and Soviet influence. But if Belgium is unified with the rest of Western Europe and the United States of America, the Soviets aren't going to mess with them. Okay, so that is the thinking behind NATO. What would George Washington say? Right. So, you know, if we were in class, I'd probably start a conversation about what about this is a permanent alliance now. We've kind of connected our fate to the fate of Western Europe. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It seems certainly like it's a necessary thing at the time. What we'll talk about in the 1980s after the fall of the Soviet Union is whether NATO still is a necessary thing. Okay, so just interesting things to think about as you're reading this chapter. All right. Some military leaders at the time were saying, hey, we've got this new weapon. Why not use it and bomb the Soviets into the Stone Age? And there's a lot of reasons why that's not a good idea. Some humanitarian, but some more practical than that, right? That World War II soldiers are not going to want to go fight another war. You're not going to have the support to fight another war with the Soviet Union. And if you go to war with the Soviet Union, you're in big trouble, right? Think about how every major land battle in Soviet territory has gone. Right? Look at all of these massive military dictators who have tried to expand their empire into Asia and have lost as a result of it. Right? So ask Napoleon how it went. Ask Kaiser Wilhelm how it went. Ask Hitler how it went. And then there's this thought too that even if we did use this new weapon, while we're the only ones who have it, in this brief window while we're the only ones who have it, that their country is so big that it would have taken so many atomic bombs in such a concentrated area that they might not have been effective anyways, right? And then lastly, I mean, hopefully we're thinking that there's just a problem with using these types of weapons in the first place, right? So there's some humanitarian concerns. There's obviously environmental concerns. So it's not an ideal to use atomic weapons at all. Okay, let's watch a short video on the Korean War. You can skip this if you're not interested, but I thought I would play it because this is going to be the first outbreak of violent fighting in the Cold War, and it's going to be the first of what we'll call proxy wars. So the Soviet Union and the United States are not technically fighting. It's going to be a partitioned, divided Korea that is going to be fighting. Really, though, it is a fight between the Soviet-backed powers and the U.S.-backed powers. Let's see if I can get this video to. Okay, so first time I recorded, I was not recording tab audio, so I'm inserting this new clip if you want to watch this video to watch it now.
The Korean War, June 25th, 1950 through July 27th, 1953. At the end of World War II in 1945, Korea was freed from Japanese control. North Korea was occupied by the Soviets while the South was occupied by American forces. By 1948, the country was divided in half at the 38th parallel, with the capitalist South ruled by Syngman Rhee and the communist North ruled by Kim Il-sung. The Soviet troops withdrew from Korea in 1948, and U.S. troops withdrew in 1949. However, North and South Korea, as enemies of one another, would not accept the border between them as permanent. The North Koreans attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950, advancing across the 38th parallel. Around 75,000 troops of the North Korean People's Army defeated the Republic of Korea's army with success, capturing the capital city of Seoul, then occupying the whole of South Korea except for Busan. This was a problem, as President Truman in the United States wanted to contain the spread of communism by preventing the domino effect. That is, if Korea fell, so would other countries to the ideology. South Korea appealed for support, and the United States pushed a resolution through the United Nations Security Council. The USSR did not use its veto power, as it was boycotting the council because the new communist China was not accepted. In China's seat was the pro-US Chinese nationalist government of Taiwan. An appeal was made by the Security Council for North Korea to withdraw its troops, but was ignored. As a result, approval was granted for a UN army made up of an international force of 16 nations to send help to South Korea, commanded by General Douglas MacArthur. The UN troops, composed mainly of Americans, landed in South Korea in early July, but were soon pushed back on the defense by the North Korean forces, forming a perimeter around Busan to defend the line until reinforcements arrived in August. Now that their position was strengthened, MacArthur went on the offensive. On September 15th, the U.S. Marines X-Corps launched an amphibious assault at Incheon. The North Korean troops were pushed back on the retreat over the 38th parallel, and soon Seoul was recaptured along with the whole of South Korea by the end of the month. Now, MacArthur was to go beyond the initial idea of containment. Truman, worried of a Chinese response, nevertheless approved, and UN troops moved into North Korea on October 7, 1950. On October 12th, they captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. and then the Yalu River, which was the border with communist China. China retaliated by helping the North Koreans, sending 250,000 Chinese troops. The UN troops, overwhelmed by this new force, were pushed out of North Korea with heavy losses. By January 1951, Chinese and North Korean troops had captured Seoul. General MacArthur wanted to use the atom bomb on China and was dismissed for insubordination by President Truman, who went back to a policy of containment. In June 1951, more UN troops were sent to Korea, eventually driving the North Korean army to the 38th parallel and stabilizing the front. Now, a stalemate set in. In July, peace talks began, but a compromise could not be found. Meanwhile, fighting continued and American pilots fought in the air against Soviet pilots using Chinese jet fighters and wearing Chinese uniforms. General Dwight D. Eisenhower took over as president in early 1953 and sought an end to the war. After 2 years of negotiation, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, at Panmunjom on the 38th parallel. A demilitarized zone was set up, which stands to this day.
Okay, so just a quick recap. So remember, the Korean Peninsula is invaded from the north by the Soviets and from the south by the Americans, and that's going to lead to some tensions. Eventually, the Soviets are going to withdraw. The U.S. is going to withdraw, but not before they've kind of established some loyalties from both the North and the South. So as we just saw in the video, this is a proxy war. Basically, most of the troops are coming from the United States. Then we're going to see troops coming from China. Then we're going to see Soviets flying in Chinese uniforms. So the goal of the United States, the goal of Truman, was to contain communism. You could see that there was some tension there when MacArthur wanted to advance and go into China, use atomic bombs. That's why he gets fired. So here's this kind of progression of how the war went in terms of territory. But at the end of the day, you can see we go from up here, we've got the 1950 slide where we have this partitioning and then this conflict. And then here in 1953, basically the same partitioning. All right. The interesting thing about this conflict is that the North Koreans and the South Koreans were seeking unity, but they wanted different types of government. And when the election is about to come, the communists realize they're not going to fare well, and so they kind of withdraw, and the whole thing falls apart. The Korean War, there are so many similarities to the Vietnam War. So we're gonna revisit the Korean War, and that's why I'm going over this now. There's a lot of similar things that are going to happen in Vietnam in terms of a divided country seeking to reunify, half supported by the communists, half supported by the United States and democratic Western European nations. All right, but primarily the United States. All right. So again, kind of the keys of this war. MacArthur's going to get fired because he wants to advance on China and like make this a war against communism. But Truman is committed to Kennan's idea, this idea of containment. So the war is ultimately going to end in a stalemate, which is a success for containment, right? So there is no further fighting. Okay, so interesting legacies, right, of the Korean War as well. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but I would encourage you to look into this. We know that today we have this kind of continuation of this tension between North and South Korea, technically still at war. It's an armistice. It's a ceasefire. President Trump was hopeful that there would be some resolutions. That happens pretty much every time there's a new U.S. president. The North kind of tests the waters and sees how the president's going to respond, and obviously nothing has really changed. Okay, some ideas that you need to be thinking about that are kind of going to define diplomacy and policy at this time is one is massive retaliation. The idea is if we threaten our enemy with massive retaliation, they will not attack us. This is also known as mutually assured destruction, right? If you attack us, we're going to just destroy you, right? A little attack on us, we will nuke your country, right? So there's this looming threat. So nobody wants to be the first one to attack for fear that they're going to get totally decimated. But it doesn't mean we're not going to push each other's buttons, and that is brinksmanship, right? That we're going to push each other and push each other and push each other, and we're going to get very, very close to these nuclear threats becoming reality. Okay. At home, what you should be reading about, we'll talk more about this later this week, is a second Red Scare, right? With the rise of McCarthyism. There's going to be, this real sense that the Soviets are invading the United States. We'll talk a little bit about what happens with McCarthy next time. Truman's going to require loyalty oaths from people in government. There's going to be some specific examples of Soviet spies in the government and people selling nuclear secrets. And then people with sympathy towards Marxist ideas and communism are going to be blacklisted and singled out. So a lot of really interesting stuff from that time period too. Again, in terms of, hey, there's this threat. How are we going to respond to that threat? Okay, so that's it for today. Origin starting of the Cold War. We'll talk a little bit more about Chapter 23. I'll post the next lecture by Thursday. And be sure that you take the quiz by Friday.